Beyond Crazy, Eufemia F. A Daughter's Story. I was 14 years old when I found out my mother had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. That was almost 20 years ago. 13 years ago, I left home, and ever since I have had this recurring dream, which is technically more of a nightmare. The dream begins with me visiting my parents and realizing they have had another baby. It ends with me trying to kidnap the baby to save it from suffering the same childhood I had, filled with confusion, pain, and misunderstanding. I always wake up in a panic. My parents were introduced to each other by my grandparents in Bonefro, Italy. My mother's illness was discovered in a roundabout way in 1983. She was involved in a minor car accident and fled the scene. My father and I deliberated for 4 hours before we called the police. As immigrants, my parents avoided authority figures as much as possible. When the police arrived, they interviewed each of us, and my father admitted without much prompting that my mother was difficult to live with on a daily basis. After a few questions directed to her were answered by laughter, an officer suggested my mother would probably need professional help. Shortly after I left home at 19 and moved to the West Coast, my father collapsed on a job, emotionally, mentally, and physically drained. It happened 2 weeks before Easter, when I was scheduled to come home for a visit. He had been hallucinating about Jesus before he had collapsed. He thought somehow he had offended Christ. Diagnosed with diabetes, he was briefly sent to a psychiatric ward because of the hallucinations. No one called to tell me. The first thing I noticed when I got home was my father's jitteriness. He wouldn't sit still. He paced. He couldn't sleep. He hardly ate. He told me he needed to speak with me. My father was terrified as he explained to me that it wasn't schizophrenia holding my mother in its grip, but the devil himself. She was part of a family of bad witches who could curse anyone in her path
with the evil eye.
She was sent to us by the devil, my father insisted, and she could cause us great harm. She already has, I said, and this is bullshit. I felt there was no longer hope for a future of sane communications with either of them. My mother, meanwhile, was thrilled with my father's collapse and began to say he had been the crazy one all along. Recently, my father joined a support group specifically for Italian Canadians with mentally ill relatives. Surprisingly, this came about through a phone call my mother made to the police. Over the years, they have made many visits to the house. She called to complain that it was impossible to live with my father. Within moments of meeting my mother, the officer suggested my father needed support services and gave him a phone number. He also set up an appointment for my father. I'm so grateful for this turn of events. My father now has a group to talk with who have similar backgrounds and experiences. For many reasons I respect, my father won't abandon my mother, even when other relatives suggest he should. My father has a great deal of empathy and doesn't want to desert my mother. He's been ridiculed for this by some of the ever-ready-to-dispense advice members of the clan, but he's also respected for his incredible strength and his many attempts to find a solution. I've also started attending a support group for family members. 15 years ago, the only support service I could find was specifically for parents of schizophrenics. Now there is a great deal more information and awareness, although still not enough. My hope is that no one will ever have to feel alone with this painful secret again. The impact on my mother's illness has been enormous. I never take for granted a good conversation with anyone because I know the frustration and agony of not being able to communicate with a loved one. There are days now when we break through the barrier of illness and my mother manages to laugh, converse, or express herself clearly. Those are the days I celebrate. Woohoo! After Eufemia wrote this story for us, she was hired as a full-time researcher-writer for the British Columbia Schizophrenia Society. She is now helping to develop an educational program for family members that will be used across the country.